Thank you for joining us for virtual money talks for safer streets. We're going to do a budget training or budget advocacy training with our policy director, Michael Kelly, today. My name is Liz Harris. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a marketing and events coordinator for Bike Walk KC. And I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat if you like. We are recording this session. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the live transcript for the program, and then you can also choose to show captions down at the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And then you all will be able to turn on the captions on your own screen if you like. Now, I will warn you that they're coming from Zoom, and their captioning function is mostly okay, but you will have to probably make your own connections because they don't always translate the speech to text especially accurately. So I'm going to keep all of our attendees muted for right now just to get us started on the program. Michael has quite a bit to cover in just our little lunch and learn hour that we have, but we did receive your questions when you registered, and we will definitely be going through those. A lot of questions will probably be answered in the presentation that Michael will be offering right now. And then please ask your questions in the chat box, and we will talk about those as we have time towards the end of the program. We want to make sure that you feel prepared to go and speak up for your priorities in the Kansas City, Missouri municipal budget process. And I think with that, I am going to let our policy director, Michael Kelly, have the floor.
Well, thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Michael Kelly. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the policy director for Bike Walk KC, and I am here to talk with you all about some budgets in KCMO and how you can advocate for safer streets. Can I get a thumbs up on this? Is this working? Okay. All right. So let's go on ahead and get started. So again, we're going to be walking through the KCMO budget and how you can advocate within that space. I am the policy director. I'm also going to be joined for a short portion of this presentation by our executive director, Eric Rogers. And the mission of Bike Walk KC is to redefine our streets as places for people to build a culture of active living. So before we get into the discussion of the budget advocacy, I did want to take a moment to give an overview of Bike Walk KC as an organization. And so our work to achieve our mission falls into 5 primary areas of focus. Number 1 is advocacy. We advocate for a better built environment for people who want or need to walk, cycle, roll, or more. This means speaking up for the policies, plans, and projects which make these forms easier and more reliable throughout the metro and beyond. With education, Bike Walk KC is one of the largest programs of its kind in the country. We work to teach children how to ride and walk safely, maintain their bikes, and more. And during the pandemic, we have shifted to more virtual settings, but we are now beginning to do activities in person as well. We also have a community planner on staff who works to provide technical assistance to municipalities and other stakeholders working on planning and projects that will bring those important changes to the built environment. This includes work on traffic calming demonstration projects, as well as citywide planning documents for active transportation. Additionally, Bike Walk KC relies on data collection to tell a story and provide support to our planning advocacy efforts, best encapsulated within our community dashboard. Where reliable data is missing, we are able to partner with experts and organizations to research these issues to improve understanding of important topics. And finally, we run the local bike share program. We have rolled out electric assist bikes to give riders a boost and are working to extend our offerings into more parts of the region in the near future. All of our bikes are now dockless, meaning that you don't need to return them to a kiosk to end a ride, but you do need to park it out of the right of way so it doesn't block the sidewalk. So in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, we're really going to be working to answer these 4 questions and areas. So what's in the KCMO budget? How was that budget created? What are the ways that you can advocate within that process? And finally, what is Bike Walk KC going to be asking for as well? So before we jump into that, I did want to share a glossary of terms to help frame the conversation to make sure everyone is on the same page. So complete streets are streets for everyone. Regardless of your preferred mode, you can get from one place to another as easily and reliably as someone else. Complete streets policies work to make this idea a reality. With traffic calming, this can be understood as a general term which refers to any sorts of changes to a street intended to make it safer for people, including drivers. A walk audit is an activity where people walk along a given space to evaluate the aspects of walkability within that space. Bike share, as we previously discussed, is a system of shared bicycles that people can use to ride from one place to another. When we're referring to the BIL and the IIJA, this refers to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a major piece of federal legislation adopted last year with lots of funding for active transportation. Vision Zero is the idea that traffic violence is a public health crisis and that we have to address it through systemic change. KCMO adopted a Vision Zero action plan in 2022 to help guide efforts to end traffic violence by 2030. Speaking of traffic violence refers to the crashes, injuries, fatalities, and other violence created by our current transportation system. A high injury network. As part of the Vision Zero action plan, KCMO identified a high injury network of dangerous streets, and researchers found that 68% of crashes involving serious injury or fatalities happen on just 12% of Kansas City roads. A road diet is where a street is narrowed to reallocate that space for other users. The Federal Highway Administration has found they can lower crashes by as much as 48%. And finally, protected bike lanes are bike lanes separated from vehicular traffic with some sort of physical barrier, such as a flex post or a curb. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our Executive Director, Eric Rogers, to talk a little bit more about what's actually in the budget.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll just walk through real quick kind of what goes into the budget and how it works. So Kansas City has a $2 billion budget. When that sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, but by the time you slice it and dice it between all of the different things it goes to, it does get cut up into hundreds of different individual line items. So on this slide over on the left is some of the main sources of revenue that the city gets that comes into the budget. Highlighted some of the key ones are the property taxes, earnings tax, the sales and use tax, and then service charges, which are things like paying for services and classes at community centers and whatnot.
And in terms of like working with the budget and how things,
there's really not a lot of flexibility for them on the revenue side. Missouri has something called the Hancock Amendment, which limits how much municipalities like Kansas City can raise or change taxes from year to year. Any significant change in taxes has to go to a vote of all of the voters in the city. So when the city talks about budgeting, a lot of that talk ends up being about the spending side rather than the revenue side, because there's just not a lot of flexibility on the revenue side. So for a lot of the issues that we work on, the main kind of spending categories come under transportation and infrastructure. And then here on the right side, the neighborhoods, housing, and healthy communities bucket. So Michael, if you'll go to the next slide, we'll drill down a little bit more for you all. Into those two specific spending categories. So first, transportation and infrastructure. This is where a lot of sidewalks and bike lanes and crosswalks, the ADA and accessible curb ramps and other facilities all kind of come out of the public works budget, which is about $200 million. So it's a pretty small percentage of the overall $2 billion of the whole budget. And like many things in this budget, a lot of things get passed on to other agencies or service providers. So here where it says transportation authorities, that's where the city collects the sales tax that funds the local transit system, the KCATA, the bus system. So a lot of that money just gets passed right on to KCATA and it doesn't actually get spent by the city. And then under the other big bucket of neighborhoods, housing, and healthy communities, we look a lot at the Parks and Rec budget. That is where things like trails and other amenities that aren't, under public works get funded from Parks and Rec. Again, there's a lot of this money that just gets passed on to other agencies. So for example, the couple lines above, that's for health and medical care. The city collects a property tax that then gets passed on to fund things like Truman Medical Center and Children's Mercy Hospital and some of the other clinics in the community like Sam Rogers or Swope Health. So a lot of that just gets passed on and isn't really part of the budget. Some other things up at the top, like public safety, that includes things like the fire department, the police department, the ambulance system, and some of those. In Missouri, we're mandated to spend a certain percentage of the city budget on the police department. And then the city traditionally has gone above and beyond. If you look at police and fire together, they take up probably about 70% of what's called the general fund, the flexible money that the city can use on different things. So when you take that 70% out, you're looking with just a few $100 million out of the whole $2 billion that are really flexible and allow for the city to shift between different priorities in terms of what they fund. So it's a lot of money overall, but when you get down to the nuts and bolts, a lot of it's already spoken for and dedicated to other uses. And so when our city leaders are making budget decisions, they don't have a lot of extra money to work with. And so increasing funding in one area means you've got to find a way to decrease funding elsewhere to pay for it. That's kind of the big overview of the picture. I'll turn it back over to Michael to dig into more of the specifics, and then we can take more questions at the end.
Thank you, Eric. And so, yeah, so with that overview of the budget itself, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what the process for the budget creation and adoption looks like in KCMO. So to begin, there are some key elements in the timeline for how our proposed budget is and shaped into the final budget adopted by the City Council. Those elements include the following. So first, as part of the initial development of the budget, each city department is asked to submit a proposed budget to fund their activities for the upcoming fiscal year. There are some general parameters which lock parts of the budget in place, state mandated police funding, for example, but the departments are allowed to ask for what they think they need to fulfill their obligations to the public. It should be noted that just because they make their requests, that doesn't mean everything they ask for will be funded. This is typically done by November or December of the previous year. Given statutory guidelines, revenue information, and department requests, the budget office then sets to work developing the budget to fund city activities. So beyond those initial three elements, they may also make recommendations based on broader trends with the economy. For example, during the pandemic, the budget office recommended decreased spending because of the prevailing economic uncertainty. Given economists' concerns about a possible recession later this year, such a recommendation may come up again. So once the proposed budget is complete in early February, the budget is shared publicly and the City Council begins the process of reviewing the document and proposing changes. This is the period when they seek public feedback from everyday people like you. Council members will also make requests for certain elements on their own based on certain legislative priorities they've identified as well. Finally, the City Council is required to adopt a finalized budget by the end of March. Most of the budget elements are typically locked in by the middle of the month, but it's also common to see some last-minute legislative wrangling up to the mandated deadline. So in terms of things to keep in mind, these are again, key dates in the budget process. So again, mid-February, the budget is released, and it has been released. It's just not public on the city's website yet. Late February to early March are the public meetings, and then the end of March is the budget approval deadline. So these are the dates. KCMO has published the dates for public budget hearings, and we will share this information in the update as well. There will be 2 virtual meetings, one Saturday, February 25th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m., and another one on Tuesday, March 7th from 6 to 8:30 p.m. There will also be a hybrid meeting, so a virtual meeting with an in-person setup at City Hall, 414 East 12th Street in KCMO on Saturday, March 4th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Again, we will share this information with everyone who registered as well as the attendees on today. So now that we understand how the budget is made and what's contained within the budget, we can now talk about the ways that we can advocate within that process. So the primary way in which the City Council gathers public feedback is through a series of public meetings. These meetings occur in the time period between when the proposed budget is made public and when the City Council is obligated to adopt a finalized budget. So because of precautions around the COVID-19 pandemic, the budget meetings over the last few years have been held in a hybrid format with some in-person spots and Zoom options as well. We know that this trend is going to continue in 2023, meaning that there will be some opportunities for Safe Streets advocates to attend and make their voices heard. One other item to keep in mind, there have been challenges in the past with not enough space on the Zoom for all the folks to participate. And that means you may need to get on early and hop off shortly after you speak. So the format for the meetings has also remained more or less the same as well. All participants are asked to indicate at the beginning if they'd like to speak with regards to the budget. Then people are invited to speak to the City Council regarding their issue. All speakers are allotted 1 minute to speak to their issue. It's important to note that if you're speaking virtually, the meeting organizers will cut off your mic if you go too long over the 1 minute mark. Now, because there's a quick turnaround on scheduling, publicizing the meetings, and there aren't as many people who can make it work for their schedules, participation has typically been pretty low. Meetings scheduled for 3 hours have finished in as little as 1 because so few people show up to speak at the meetings. That's another reason why it's really important for Safe Streets advocates to show up and speak out. It takes a much smaller amount of people to grab elected officials' attention on a given issue than you may think. The KC tenants are a really instructive example of how this can work. In the last couple of years, they have flooded the meetings, often with about 25 to 30 people. And because they all speak about the same issue, the need for more safe, affordable housing, that often draws a direct response from council members at the end of public testimony. So before we get into preparing for the meetings and drafting remarks, it's important to determine what sort of budget advocacy you're doing. Especially within active transportation realm, our advocacy and budget settings typically falls within 1 or 2 categories: asking or defending. When asking for something new in the budget, the focus needs to be on the advocacy of absence and examples which demonstrate that what you're asking for works. So the advocacy of absence is using the absence of something to advocate for that something. An example would be this: because we don't have a dedicated public engagement coordinator, people aren't informed about projects. Please include funding in the budget to address the shortcoming. With examples, try to find examples from comparable communities with tangible results. And with defending, this is when you're trying to keep something in the budget which may be in jeopardy of being cut. The focus here should be on demonstrating the value of the item on the chopping block. Speak to the specific dollar amount, but then align it with clear examples of what that produces. With a small investment in complete streets, for example, we've been able to add 50 new speed humps, 30 lead pedestrian interval changes at stoplights, and 3 road diets. Public meetings mean public speaking. And while good public speaking can manifest in a number of ways, when it comes to public meetings, there are some critical ingredients to creating good remarks. First, get to the point. Decision makers are likely going to be hearing from multiple people on a given issue. Don't waste the precious time you have. Make sure you get to the point of why you're speaking, especially so you don't lose their attention. Tell a story. You were speaking about the issue for a reason. If time allows, take a moment to help the audience understand why the issue is personal for you and why you want the decision makers to do what you are asking them to do. Include data. Find facts and figures to back up what you're saying. Some general places to find good information and stats on issues like road diets and complete streets are the Federal Highway Administration and Smart Growth America. One important point on this: do not lie, ever. Making up something is significantly worse than simply admitting that you don't know something because it harms your credibility. If you lie about one thing, it can cast doubt on everything else you say. And finally, make your ask. Before you end your comments, always be sure to ask the decision makers to do what you want them to do. Whether it be voting in favor or opposition of a proposal or asking them to wait, be sure to make the explicit request. Try to do it at the beginning and end of your remarks if you can. So, with all of those elements out of the way, I want to finish our remarks and get to your questions by asking, what is Bike Walk KC asking for? And these are our specific asks for safer streets in 2023. First, public engagement funding. If recent advocacy fights, especially Truman Road, are any indication, KCMO needs to invest in more robust and targeted public engagement for transportation projects. More specifically, this should include the following: funding for dedicated staff. For too long, offices like Public Works have had to juggle multiple responsibilities for projects. This includes community engagement. A combination of limited time and funding means that staff are reduced to limited outreach, increasing the chance of missing connection opportunities with key stakeholders and sowing mistrust of existing and future projects. To avoid this, the city must fund a dedicated staff person, and likely more, in Public Works to coordinate and lead outreach efforts before projects move from the paper to the pavement. On-the-ground activities. Beyond staffing, the city should also prioritize and allocate funding for in-person, on-the-ground activities to help educate the public about potential changes and gather feedback. This can include funding for things like walk audits, which Bike Walk KC conducted for the I-70 corridors pictured here, as well as pop-up traffic calming demonstrations. The purpose of these activities is to get away from mailers and maps and better understand community conditions and priorities. Given that many of the most dangerous streets in the city also happen to run through some of the most socially and economically diverse neighborhoods of the city, it's important that the materials used for outreach are presented in a format which everyone can access and understand. That means funding specifically for translation of materials to different languages, as well as Braille and transcript offerings for those who are blind or low vision and or deaf and hard of hearing. Finally, we need to allocate funding to better organize and track engagement for projects so that residents, business owners, and other stakeholders can see what engagement has been done and where for a given project. This is the added benefit of helping to better inform and shape engagement for future projects as well. The second big item which Bike Walk KC will advocate for in the proposed budget is more funding to support the implementation of complete streets. So thanks to your advocacy efforts, Bike Walk KC was able to successfully advocate for a dedicated line item in the budget for complete streets implementation. As it stands, the city currently spends $500,000 a year on complete streets specifically. While this was an important budgetary win, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what we need to achieve our goals and work to implement Vision Zero and end traffic violence by the year 2030. So, knowing that the shortcoming exists, Bike Walk KC will ask for an increase of funding to $2 million, per year. This would mean more funding for staff to implement bike ped projects, as well as funding to update internal documents and work to deploy small-scale interventions like speed humps and bump outs. The ultimate goal of this funding is to help KCMO do more to implement the steps identified by both the Complete Streets Ordinance as well as the Vision Zero Action Plan. While there are federal grant opportunities available, having a steady source of income will enable city staff to consistently and rapidly implement these steps. And this will make it easier to do more for traffic safety and create a safer Kansas City for our most vulnerable road users. Finally, Bike Walk KC will use the budget process to advocate for dedicated funding for maintenance elements. So with the expansion of sidewalks, trails, and on-street bike paths, more people have more places to go by walking, biking, or rolling. Unfortunately, city leaders haven't always made cleaning these facilities a priority. And setting aside funds for maintenance, the primary goal would be to create a schedule for clearing key facilities and keep these spaces clear throughout the year. The most prominent example of what these maintenance elements could look like are smaller street sweepers specifically designed to clean sidewalks, trails, and on-street bike paths. Major cities elsewhere already have these in their municipal fleets, and North Kansas City, as pictured here, is the first known community in our region to have one for bike ped facilities. City staff have begun to identify maintenance of facilities as a bigger priority, particularly in the water and public works departments. Sending a clear message for these elements from both staff and the public will improve the chances of these elements being funded in the adopted budget. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and we are happy to answer whatever questions you may have. Liz?
Yeah, please, if you have more questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. We will work on them. In the meantime, I kind of wanted to go through a couple that we received in registrations today to allow the folks on the call right now to have some time to think about what they want to ask. So to start off with, let's talk a little bit more about what we as KCMO residents can do. Is there an optimal time for us to reach out to our city leaders or our electeds about bike or pedestrian infrastructure spending?
The primary time would likely be right now, now that the budget has been proposed.
That's always the answer, right? It's every day.
Yeah. every day. So but beyond the budget specifically, I'll also say that as PIAC, so the Public Improvement Advisory Committee, that's kind of how they pay for capital improvements, including sidewalk repairs and some bike improvements. That would be another opportunity to speak up. But the primary time as it relates to budget season is between early to mid-February and early to mid-March. If you wait until later in March, most of the time the budget decisions have already been made, and there really isn't as much you can do with your council member in terms of pushing them to make changes at that point.
So kind of watch those. I mean, the budget meetings are happening February, early March. So now is the time to make the biggest impact.
Yes.
Speaking of big impacts, do you think, this is from Andy, do you think our individual advocacy is most powerful if we align them with the goals we just talked about? So do you think that that individual advocates supporting kind of Bike Walk KC's budget plan or budget platform that we're talking about, do you think that individual advocates could help support that or push that forward a little further? Do you think let me try this. Do you think individual advocates, their advocacy will give power and maybe expediency to what you've outlined today? Yes.
The answer is yes. What we constantly like to say around Bike Walk KC is that advocacy is a team sport. And so nothing happens because of Bike Walk KC. It happens because Bike Walk KC worked with folks like you to get these things done. And that is especially true when it comes to the budget. So we identify these things based in part on what we've seen, what we've heard in our advocacy efforts. But what will get it over the finish line and give it the best chance of being included in the finalized budget is people like you showing up to the meetings and reaching out to your electeds and saying, please fund these things because these are a priority for me.
That makes good sense. Thank you for reading between the lines of what I was trying to say. That makes good sense. Let's see here. And another one from Andy that is related. How did KC tenants organize themselves to have such a presence at the city council meetings? Do you have an idea about how that worked? I know you've been having talks with them lately.
Yeah, so the KC tenants are just a very, very they're a very driven group. I think that what has made them really effective, especially at showing up, is that I think it's really two things. I think the first is that they do a style of engagement and community building that a lot of organizations in Kansas City don't do for one reason or another. And it is very labor intensive, it is expensive, and it takes a lot of time, but it helps to build a true groundswell of support. But the other thing that they do, and this is something that Bike Walk KC tries to do as much as possible, is they make it very clear and very simple for people to get engaged. So if you're just someone who is kind of new to City Hall, it can be very intimidating to kind of go to committee, to ask to speak on something. And they take a lot of the guesswork out. They say, please come on this day at this time to speak about this specific ordinance. And I think demystifying City Hall and making it easier for people to come in and share their experiences and encouraging people to do that in their own way is part of what has made them a really, really effective group and a force to be reckoned with, frankly.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I really admire about them is, like you were talking about community building, is they go door to door and knock on the door and say, hey, we know that rents are rising and that life can be hard sometimes, and we want you to know that we're here for you, and we would love to have your partnership to advocate for a housing thing. And I think that we've seen in other places, like once again North Kansas City, direct outreach from neighbors. If you can say, I live down the street and I would love to let my kids walk to the park a few blocks away, but there's this busy street in between our block and the park, would you join me in advocating for a safer intersection so that our kids could walk to the park together? I think that kind of direct outreach between neighbors is really effective with KC tenants, and we've seen it really effective with transportation projects too.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So Leah, I'm going to address your questions soon because we actually have some more links to share with you on that. But let me ask one more question here from the registrations, if that's all right, Michael.
Yes.
So this one is about a bit more wide reaching. So not just bike lanes, not just sidewalks. What are and this may be something that we don't know exactly yet because the budget has not been actually released. Is that correct?
Right. We still haven't seen the specifics of the budget yet.
So this might be something more like, what do you expect? And this for this year. What are some of the big areas that the budget is set out for, including safety and maintenance for bus stops, making sidewalks more ADA accessible, paying bus drivers fair pay, and moving closer to towards all electric vehicles for Ride KC?
So a big part of that is not contained within KCMO's budget. That's within KCATA budget, which KCMO does pay a portion of, but is only a part of their budget. And so in terms of being able to get funding for electric buses, that's largely coming at the moment through federal programs created by the bipartisan infrastructure law. Those are competitive grants, and it's going to take KCATA time to procure the funds to get all of those buses converted. Same thing goes for increasing money for stops. In terms of increasing funding for better pay, that's also something that's largely within the KCATA. So it is not that we don't know because it's not in the KCMO budget, it's that we don't know because it's within the KCATA budget. And so a lot of the advocacy around improving those elements would likely be focusing on the KCATA rather than KCMO. And I'm not sure if Eric had anything more he wanted to potentially add on that part.
I would just say to Michael's point that the way transit is funded in Kansas City is unfortunately pretty complex. So the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority, as the overall provider of transit, gets funding from every community that it operates in. So Kansas City decides how much transit they want, and then they budget that and pay ATA to provide that. Or, you know, City of Lee Summit decides how much transit they want and then pays ATA to provide that for them. There's actually some initiatives in the region to look at how can we create a more regional funding system for transit so that it's not so divided up city by city. Especially so we can have better service like between cities or from suburb to suburb. We're still early in those days, but we are starting to talk with some transit advocates about that and hope to be able to talk more about that in the future.
I think that's something that is on our policy platform for this year, right? Is advocating for a regional transit funding plan so that the whole region can have better transit. Yes.
It is something that we are working to understand and explore. The main thing I would say for people who are interested in understanding that more is to connect with the Kansas City Regional Transit Alliance, because that's kind of the advocacy group that's really trying to take the lead on those conversations and that research.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get to Leah's question about Truman Road. Her question is, were you the group that funded the new bike trails on Truman? I can't believe the struggle that happened after the bike lanes were implemented.
So, Bike Walk KC does not fund or pay for the installation of new facilities. We're a separate nonprofit that is an activity that is handled by the city. In terms of how it was funded, it was really kind of following the city's resurfacing schedule. And so the city knew they were going to resurface Truman Road, and they were able to determine that it would be significantly cheaper to install the protected bike lanes immediately after the resurfacing had been completed than to tear up the street just to install the bike lanes later on. And so that was largely decided through that process, as well as a considerable amount of community engagement. And so what I'll say with regards to kind of the struggles around that is that while there may have been required community engagement done, whether or not that was actually sufficient is an area of debate. And so I think the lesson that we want to learn and take from Truman Road is that if we are going to do community engagement, we need to actually pay for better engagement, because if we don't, then we get situations like Truman. And that's a big part of the reason why Bike Walk KC is advocating for more dedicated funding for public engagement in the proposed budget this year.
And just to be clear, like when you say that if we want better community engagement, we need to pay for it, you mean we as in like the royal we, like this, like the city,
yes.
the city of Missouri, yeah, us as a community.
When I mean we, as in if we want better, then we have to pay for it. I mean we as a city. The city hall has to pay for better community engagement.
Sure, that makes good sense. And I can follow up. We've got some blog posts that kind of walk you through the process of Truman Road and that kind of stuff to go along with it. That has a whole lot more information than we have time for this afternoon. And I hope that will answer your question, Leah. Does anybody else have questions before we wrap up for the day?
Can I just ask one last one there? And you mentioned that the dedicated outreach kind of team that you included in your budget proposal or advocacy. And I'm curious, is there a model in other cities where that works well? I have, honestly, I think mixed feelings about that, but I'm not super versed in how those work maybe elsewhere.
So sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can take that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
We've been doing some research on this to see where else there is better engagement, and we found that there are a few cities that have some pretty robust community engagement policies. We've seen examples in Atlanta and Pittsburgh, and then also in Durham, North Carolina. Those are kind of the three we're looking at. And the other thing we're kind of asking is for folks that are saying that engagement isn't sufficient, we'd like to hear more of what they think would be sufficient. Tell us exactly where the city's falling short so that we can have some specifics. It's one thing to just say, well, we need to do a better job, but how do we define what's a better job? So that's something that we want to dig into more this year.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. Awesome, awesome questions. We really appreciate getting to have a conversation with folks. Anytime we do a training like this, it works out better for everybody if we can hear what you have to say and what your questions are so that we can answer them directly. And Jeannie Moore just added a comment to the chat. She suggested getting emails from KCMO. You can go to the city's website and you can sign up for newsletters. You can get them from your council district. You can also get them from the city. And that's another way to help get to stay on top of things. I know I go through every morning and the first thing that I do is delete all of the emails that I'm never going to open. But those are the kinds of emails that I will actually open because those I know are dealing directly with where I live and where I work and where I spend basically all of my time. Well, thank you all for joining us today for Money Talks for Safer Streets. We really appreciate it. Obviously, you are all interested in this kind of work. You are enthusiastic and ready to go on and take the next step and be strong advocates for your community. If you are if you have not yet joined BIPOC KC, we invite you to invest in the work that we're doing together because it really does, Michael said it, this is a team sport. And we need you and you need us and we need because together we're going to make a much bigger impact than if it were just me or Michael or Rogers or Jeannie, any of us doing it on our own. Together we're stronger. We would love to have you become a member of BIPOC KC. Also be sure to join our advocacy alerts mailing list. Perhaps you are already on it and that's why you joined in today because you got an email from us about it. But the advocacy alerts mailing list, we send out policy and planning newsletters occasionally that will kind of give an overview of regional stories and opportunities to get engaged. But we also send out specific to your zip code or specific to the city that you have listed. When you sign up for the newsletter, we will send you advocacy alerts as we hear about them. So if there is a council meeting coming up, or if there is a budget hearing, or some kind of opportunity for you to speak up for safer streets and happier, healthier communities, we try to get those out in a timely manner directly to the zip codes that are affected by them. So we hope you can do that. And then the last thing is we record these sessions and we put them on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel that has our virtual events and we also have we have a specific advocacy training training playlist. So you can watch our basic advocacy 101 class, and you can watch several others that will get you up to date, and you can dig as deep as you want to dig. We appreciate all of you for joining us this afternoon, whatever time it is. This afternoon, I will be sending out a follow-up email either later today or tomorrow that will have a whole bunch of these links in it, plus more information that I hope you'll find useful. Stay tuned for our next events coming up later this year, and we really appreciate all of you for being here. Thanks.
Thank you so much.